Welcome everybody. On behalf of Professor Kevin Kenny, the Glucksman Chair of Irish History and the Director of Glucksman Ireland House, as well as Eileen Flannelly-Mackle, the President of the Irish Institute, I welcome friends near and far to the 14th Annual Irish Institute Lecture. And before we start, I'm just going to give you a brief background on the Irish Institute, which has existed since 1950. It was dedicated from its beginning to promoting the bonds of friendship between the people of Ireland and those of the United States by encouraging Irish cultural pursuits, including art, music, dance, language, law, history, and folklore, and to supporting the institutions and scholars who study and preserve and display those fields, and also to suitably mark and record the accomplishments of Irish immigrants in the United States. So an early advocate for Irish American studies. For about 30 years, they had a building on Manhattan's West Side on West 48th Street, but they also quietly pursued financial support of cultural projects in Ireland and America, often crucial seed money in the early days of organizations. And since they sold the building in 1982, they have been able to increase the size of their philanthropy, and they are still making grants today. Among some of their contributions were early, 1966, $150,000 to the John F. Kennedy Memorial Arboretum in Wexford. And on the home front here in New York, they subsidized, because they thought scholarship should be rewarded financially. They funded a landmark book, The New York Irish, by Ron Baer, edited by Ron Baer and Timothy Marr. And then Ireland House was founded in 1993, and the Irish Institute from its inception has been a champion of the work that Glucksman Ireland House has been doing, and in 2006 decided to endow an annual lecture. The very first lecture was Diarmuid Martin on New Ireland, New Church, which brings us almost full circle to today's talk. And I would like to now hand over to my colleague and good friend, Dr. Miriam Nyhan-Gray, who is the Associate Director of Glucksman Ireland House, who will introduce the 14th Annual Irish Institute Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for being here as wearing your hat as a Glucksman Ireland House NYU team member and a member of the Irish Institute. And let me reiterate how grateful we are for the continued support of the Irish Institute and how much we commend them on the work that they do in America and in Ireland. Indeed, we're very, very grateful for the support and really, really honoured to host this conversation with two really inspiring ambassadors for Ireland and Irish America today, the former President of Ireland, President Mary McAleese, and our own Irish American, James Carroll. Before I just hand over to two people who need very little introduction, I will go through a short bio for both of them, but really they don't need much of an introduction. And before I hand over graciously to our great friend, James Carroll, who we're still on a high. He very generously donated his time and energies to our recent Black Irish conference, and we're still basking in the ideas and provocations that he rewarded us with in that participation. And President McAleese, always such a wonderful supporter of what we do at Glucksman Ireland House. She was a wonderful honoree at our recent 2021 gala, and we're just so honored to have you both here today. From a logistical point of view, I just want to point out for anyone who needs it, we have closed captioning turned on. If you just hit the CC button at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to follow those captions. I also want to encourage you, we have a chat function and we have a Q&A function, and James has agreed to, we'll watch the Q&A. If you, your questions, if you could put them into the Q&A function of Zoom, that would be incredibly helpful. And as we open up through from the conversation into questions, we'll gladly engage as many of your questions as possible. So our moderator today, our interviewer today is James Carroll, who attended Georgetown University before entering the seminary to train for the Catholic priesthood. He received BA and MA degrees from St. Paul's College in Washington and was ordained to the Catholic priesthood in 1969. Jim served as Catholic chaplain at Boston University until 1974. Then he left the priesthood and became a writer, and he's widely acclaimed for his writings almost ever since. His memoir received the 1996 National Book Award in nonfiction, and his book Constantine Sword, The Church and the Jews, A History, published in 2001, was a New York Times bestseller and won a plethora of other awards. His periodic articles have frequently appeared in the New Yorker and other esteemed journals. And his most recent book, published earlier in the spring of this year, is called The Truth at the Heart of the Lie: How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. And already you can see the synergies with our speaker today. It's an immense point of personal privilege, to borrow Loretta Brennan-Luxman's phrase, to introduce President Mary McAleese, who was inaugurated as the 8th President of Ireland in 1997. The first president from Northern Ireland. She was re-elected in 2004. She is currently Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin, and in her recently published memoir, Here's the Story, President McAleese traces her astonishing life from her youth in Northern Belfast to her triumphant terms as President of Ireland, and she has not sat on her laurels since that. She's kept busy, and we're really looking forward to the conversation with Jim in this regard. In her memoir, she provides insights into the Northern Ireland Irish peace process and details her encounters with everyone from prime ministers to priests. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to you now, Jim, and to President McAleese. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
And thank you, Marion, and thank you
Hi,
all.
Jim. And hi, everybody.
And thank you all who are making this possible. The great personal privilege for me to be with President McAleese, Mary. Again, we had a warm encounter. I remember vividly at Boston College when you were there a few years ago. But I've also been in your presence via Zoom a number of times. It's one of the curious things about this present circumstance we live in. There you are in Dublin. Miriam is sitting in New York City. I'm in Massachusetts. And yet we have this intimate encounter. It's going to be a precious few minutes. I'm so grateful for it. Mary, speaking of that context, what's life in Dublin like right now with COVID rearing its ugly head again?
Yes,
what are you dealing with?
We're dealing with a situation that I think within the next few minutes could probably change, because we're awaiting new instructions from our government as to how we're going to cope with this, with the latest wave and spikes in COVID. Our experts seem to think that we have plateaued, and that, but they are also warning, of course, that over 90%, in fact, 93% of our people are fully vaccinated.
Amazing.
But that's, amazing. We're one of the highest, I think, in the world in terms of pickup of vaccine. And yet we have had a fairly significant spike in vaccines, which put our hospitals under pressure and our ICUs under pressure. Now that seems to have plateaued and does seem to be on a slightly downward trend, though it's hard to be absolutely clear. But what they're saying to us is, look, we're coming into a time of national conviviality and sociability. We visit each other's houses. Everybody has the office party. We have the family gatherings. And it looks like what they're going to be saying to us is, please don't do that. Mm-hmm. At least not for the next few weeks. Let's try and get this thing under control. We do know that last year, when we lifted some of the restrictions around Christmas time, we didn't do ourselves any justice, really. We caused problems. So in terms of spread of the virus. We're lucky in some respects that having taken action very early on, going way back to last year, our death rate has been relatively modest, but still, 5,000 people. It's a lot of people a lot of homes that are miserable this Christmas. And including, I have to say, one of my great friends who died during the year. I think pre-vaccine, if he'd had the vaccine, life would have been so different. We're so lucky to live at a time when we have that. And we're so lucky to have a population that, generally speaking, is very vaccine compliant. But like everybody else, we're just on tenterhooks waiting to see what comes next. South African variant, we're variant. We're just getting used to this new Omicron name, and yeah, who knows? I don't know what it's like with you, but that's what it's like with us. On the other hand, Ireland's economy, is just set to boom yet again. But our poor old hospitality sector has taken quite a hit, and our entertainment sector has taken a huge hit.
Yeah, it's curious, Mary. For me and for many of us, I'm sure for you, this pandemic challenge has boiled down to a very unusual confrontation with mortality. The loss of friends and family, many of them who died alone, our own anxiety about the health of our own intimate ones, our own health. And yet, you're a woman who, in your youth, was in a very special and difficult way confronted with mortality every day because of what you experienced in North Belfast. I had the great edification of reading your book not long ago, and you are reckoning with the threats, the common presence of death in your own neighborhood, among your dearest friends. I think of the story you tell of the news that came to you and Martin on your wedding night of your dear friends' deaths. I hope it's not presumptuous of me, what do you make of mortality, and how do you square your radical experience of it as a young woman with the life you went on to lead then? How did that affect you?
I became very early on acclimatized to the idea of death, and death that wasn't necessarily preceded by a long life, and wasn't necessarily preceded by a peaceful dying. So fairly early on in my life, I became acclimatized to the possibility of death. I also think that it's one of the things that I would credit my upbringing, in the Catholic Church, and probably is true for many Christians. The confrontation with death is a perennial. We're always confronted with the cross and with Christ's death and with the reality of death, and also with the belief in resurrection. So fairly early on, somewhere along the line, I won't say I was ever blasé about death. I would not say that, but I've become acclimatized to it and accepting of it, and also accepting of its randomness, that you're waking up each day, find yourself alive, and think, well, that's okay. I'm alive for another day. And that's about as much as any of us are guaranteed, is the moment. So somewhere say I've never ever been a person who resented death. I don't resent death. I accept it as the price we pay for life. So I'm fairly. That's not to say that I would be a great patient if I was dying now, because I mightn't be the greatest patient ever if I was dying. But I've often contemplated it, and I remember years ago reading a book on Buddhism, which told me that everybody should contemplate their deaths for at least 5 minutes every day. And I'm a meditator. So somewhere along the line, I started to absorb that. And without being maudling, or narcissistic, that's been part of my daily kind of prayer life or meditative life, the meditation upon death and the thankfulness that today I'm alive. And if I am alive and if I have energy, then what am I going to do with that? Am I going to make it any way useful? Am I going to put it at the service of the things that I think are important? So that's how I come at death. I'd prefer to live a long life, and I'm lucky. I would prefer, but I'm also reconciled with the fact that I have 70 years of age, so I'm doing okay so far. And and my husband too. And my mother is 90 years of age, still driving, still knitting, still walking every day, still playing bridge 3 nights a week. So I'm hoping I've got her DNA. I'm really hoping that I have her DNA.
You were determined as a young woman to live your life as normally as possible, despite the catastrophic challenges around you. And you went on to become a lawyer. I think you were one of the first women admitted to the Northern Ireland bar. You became an academic. You became a kind of politician. But you, through it all, the thing that strikes me most about you is the theme you claim for yourself as president, which is bridge builder. I have to tell you, Mary, I was so moved to read about the bridge built over the Boyne Valley. Would you tell us about that bridge?
Yes.
and how it came to be and what it means to you? It was dedicated
Well,
after you left.
It bears my name. Yeah, it bears my name, which is a wonderful thing. But the bridge is over the River Boyne. And anybody who knows a little bit of Irish history will know that the word Boyne, the Boyne, usually is preceded by the words, the Battle of the Boyne, going back to 1690, which really cast the sectarian cloud, over Ireland. Not to say that there hadn't been sectarian politics beforehand, there had, and indeed for the century beforehand. But the truth of the matter is, this was a war, actually, essentially a European war between King James and King William, a son-in-law and a father-in-law. But the impact on Ireland was to enhance a kind of a sense of what I might call a Protestant ascendancy, because the Catholics lost that battle. And so even though in the great complication of things, the Protestant monarch who won was actually backed by the Pope. So here's the Boyne River, which is where this great battle took place, that set in train much of the sectarian pathways that were still current, still had a long shelf life when I was growing up. And people were still reenacting the Battle of the Boyne. The 12th of July, which is notionally when it happened, is the big festival day in Northern Ireland. And to say that it was a triumphalist festival, of Protestantism over Catholicism, and very often a kind of a sectarian fest as well. Though many people in recent years have tried to turn it into a cultural fest that everybody could enjoy. But so the Boyne, where the bridge is within sight of the battlefield. It's just outside of Drogheda. It's a very beautiful bridge, actually, a very pretty bridge. And I was very honored to have it called after me. But it meant a lot to me because it's on the road north, or if I'm heading north from Dublin, that's the bridge you're going over. And when I was president, that was the theme I took. It's a very simple notion of building bridges. And the idea was to try and build relationships that had been fractured. If the bridge wasn't over the Boyne, you've got to go the long way around. And we've been going the long way around in Ireland to get, to build relationships for centuries. So my view was to try and reach out to people when I was president, people who over their dead bodies would ever talk to an Irish president, people who over their dead bodies would ever come across that bridge. And that was what I was president for 14 years, for 2 terms. So that was what my husband and I committed to, because we were fortunate in this respect, if you could call it fortunate. We both grew up as Catholics in Protestant areas of Belfast. Now, Northern Ireland's very ghettoized. It was very, very ghettoized. I think over 90% of people live in areas that are either Catholic or Protestant. We didn't. We both lived in Protestant areas, but we were the rare Catholics in those Protestant areas, which meant in my case, though not in Martin's, he lived in a much more toxic environment than I did, funnily enough, initially. I grew up among ordinary working class Protestants who became my great friends. We were, my sisters were their bridesmaids when they married British soldiers. We were friends to one another, and those friendships allowed me to see into the space they occupied, the thinking they occupied, and it meant that I didn't inhabit a ghetto, a bubble where I, was excluded from some kind of empathy. Even though I wouldn't have agreed with their thinking or their politics, I had empathy for where they were coming from, and knew them well. So I think that was all to the good,
What I'm struck by, that there's an absolutely key piece of your biography, isn't it? That you grew up a Catholic, surrounded by Protestants.
Yes.
So that the divisions that others were imprisoned by weren't quite the same for you. But I want to just also ask you to reflect on the long arc of your involvement in the peace process. It's one of the most important things about you. Father Alex Reed brought you as a young woman into the very quiet, even secret conversations that he helps initiate between Jerry Adams and John Hume. You were present for some of those conversations. That's the beginning in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And then you became president right after, or just before the Good Friday Agreement. But then that wasn't actually brought to fulfillment until the final decommissioning of weapons, which took place just at the end of your term as president. So that arc, you're there at the beginning of Adams and Hume. You're there at the decommissioning of Uda weapons. Give us what that was for you. How did it feel? How did it happen, Mary? What did you do to make it happen?
Well, I believed emphatically and firmly in the vision of two men whom I trusted and would trust with my life. One was John Hume, and the politician par excellence, the great political pastoral leader, and Alec Reid, Father Alec Reid, two extraordinary men, visionaries, people who put themselves completely at the service of peace. Now, to understand the two of them, they were people for whom the work of peace meant every kind of sacrifice, and God only knows what horrors they both endured. I'm talking about, Alec would go back to a monastery after engaging in talks with Sinn Féin or with the IRA, and he would meet colleagues, fellow Redemptorists who thought that what he was doing was abominable. Now, so it wasn't just the Protestants out on the streets or the Unionists who would regard what he did as terrible, but some of his own people were outraged by him trying to forge this alliance, which wasn't actually an alliance at all. It was a thinking tank. It was to try, and he saw that if he could get the IRA off the stage, because he knew that they had plateaued, they were going nowhere. They'd been going nowhere for years. They couldn't win and they couldn't lose. The British couldn't win and couldn't lose. It was catch-22. But nobody was doing anything to break out of that. There was no new thinking and within those bubbles. And he knew that John Hume was the man with the vision. John had had it for donkey's years, and he preached it and preached it. He nagged until people eventually listened. And it was Alec going to the prisons, talking to the prisoners, realizing they were tired, and this was a moment. We would never get this moment back again, when the prisoners were tired and were therefore amenable to the idea that there was a better way of achieving what they wanted. There was, as Alec always said to me, no point in me going in as a priest to the prison and saying to them, you do know it's against the commandments, to kill people, because they would say, yeah, we know that, but in brackets, we're freedom fighters and therefore we're exempt. So pointless. You had to give them something that offered them the way for a political way forward that was realistic. And he knew that John Hume was the man who had that. And he also knew that Jerry Adams was hugely influential with the IRA. And so he wanted the conversation to begin where John would transfer his thinking to Jerry Adams. Jerry Adams would be persuaded and take that to the IRA, who would hopefully be persuaded. And then we would be on the path to peace, because until they were on ceasefire, there was never going to be the prospect of peace. And that's what happened. And it was a long journey. John Hume, I talked to John's late wife, that magnificent woman, only a few months ago before she died, just a few weeks before she died. And she said that even in her own home, there was immediately on the streets where John was adored, there was huge resentment and resistance to him engaging in this conversation. But you see, Alec knew it had to happen. He could see the further shore we had to get to. And he was prepared to endure, as was John, all the slings, all the arrows, in order to get there. And we got there because at the end of the day, their vision was right. It was a long journey. It was a dreadful journey. There were so many ups and downs, you wouldn't believe it. And then he asked myself and another man, a man called Jim Fitzpatrick. This was all done, incidentally, under what was called the Redemptorist Fathers Peace Ministry. This came out of the Catholic social tradition dedicated to peace building. So Alec is a Redemptorist priest, and he did all this with the full authority of his order, though not always the full, the full encouragement of some of his confreres, who would be the first to admit that today, that they got it wrong and he got it right. So he asked me to join these private talks with Adams and Hume. And then our job was, Jim and I, our job was to go out to what I might call key influencers, because these talks, secret though they were, a lot of people knew that they were going on, and John Hume was being savaged from a height, just savaged everywhere he turned. And we were to try and persuade people that what John was doing had real integrity about it, and that it also had a chance of success. So that's what we did. And I was very proud and very privileged, to be part of that.
And then you brought it to a kind of fulfillment as president, because the loyalists, at least some of the most extreme of them, had been left to feel outside the process. You brought them in. How did you do that?
We did. And again, you see, God is good in so many ways. My husband grew up in a loyalist area in East Belfast. He couldn't as he said, he couldn't go to the corner shop for a pot of jam without running the risk of some kind of a sectarian attack. He lived in fear from he was a youngster. And these people, the loyalists came in, they shot us out they came with machine guns and put us out of our home in North Belfast. In his case, a mob came into the hall, took down the picture of the Sacred Heart, stamped on it, and put them on the street with literally the clothes they stood up in. His poor mother didn't survive an awful lot longer after that. God rest her, she went to an early death over it all. But so he knew them. Martin knew them. He knew their whole hinterland. And when we went the first day we went into our snooker on the House of the President, we were both committed to this building bridges. We were both committed to try and building relationships across that gap, that historic gap, that real gap between Catholics and Protestants, loyalists and Republicans, nationalists and unionists. And we were fortunate because having grown up as I did in a Protestant environment, I had loads of Protestant friends who were very willing to come on board to work with us. We had people who volunteered out of the Protestant community. People just stepped forward, like Colonel Harvey Vicker out of the Pure Blue yonder, a committed unionist said, "I'm going to help you. I think I know what you're about, and I think it's good." And then on the same time, I had great friends in Belfast, like Solicitor Dennis Maloney, who represented loyalist prisoners and Republican prisoners, had great connections, and they were able to set up over time, they were able to set up meetings. Martin went into places in Belfast where the police would not go in to protect him because they knew they'd be at risk too. But he would go into these places, he grew up in them, and he grew up with them. And they began to realize, the loyalists began to realize, you can't pull the wool over this fella's eyes. Also, he's genuine.
And he's also the husband of the president.
Yeah, and he's genuine. He's not here for a photo op.
Yes.
He's not here for here's a photograph. He's here to build relationships, and he's prepared to put the work in. So Martin did that week in, week out. He went to Belfast. He went to all these mad clubs, these clubs that were adorned with all sorts of, not terribly welcoming Catholic insignia or anti-Catholic insignia. And he made friends of people who were, in the end, there was a decency and a goodness, but most importantly, there was a kind of a yesness in them of wanting to embrace the other, because they too knew that it had to end sometime. It had to end. Otherwise, what were we bequeathing to our children? An enduring civil war. So he put all the effort into that. And over the years, he became very friendly with the loyalist paramilitaries. And so much so that whenever they eventually decided towards the end of my first term that they were going to embrace the Good Friday Agreement, and they were going to decommission. They sent their decommissioning statement down to Martin for him to cast his eye over it and see was it all right. Well, it wasn't, and he wasn't happy with bits of it, and he sent, edited bits back, and they accepted his ideas. So that was how trusting the relationship was. He trusted them, and I think in any other circumstance, if that document had come to certain other people, they might have regarded it as, oh, these people aren't serious. This is where you break down, because in Northern Ireland terms, it never took much to break down, discussions. But Martin's attitude was, well, see, the bulk of that, and the bulk of that stuff is good. Some of it is unacceptable. Some of the language is likely to be too raw and unacceptable. But he trusted them. And then whenever he went back and said to them, I think you could change this and you could change that, it would be good for everybody if you did that, they were so accepting of his bona fides. And it was worth all the effort that we put in over the years,
Mary, listening to you, one of the things that's very striking is your powerful connection to the Catholic Church. There's Father Alex Reed, whom you just saluted. I think of Father Justin Coyne, I think his name was, for whom you named
my son is called Justin after him.
Yes, you loved the church. The church was a source of consolation and support and challenge for the world you were in. And now you find yourself as one of the most vigorous, most listened to, most important critics of the established hierarchical Catholic Church. How did that come about, and what are you making of your own identity as a Catholic today?
Well, I was very lucky. I grew up among, I was one of a big family. I'm one of 9. My mom was one of 11. She and her sisters between them and her siblings between them have 60 children, and I don't know, many hundreds now of the next generation. So, and I grew up in parish of Boyne. Catholics, obviously, a very oppressed minority. So my identity as a Catholic was probably, in a pressure cooker to some extent, because we were, the oppressed minority. But I was also very conscious, I grew up quite conscious of how the church excluded me as a woman. Found that as a lawyer, particularly interested in human rights law, very unacceptable. But over time, I still have this phenomenal regard and love for the people of God that I met on the way. People who put up with all sorts of, whether it was poverty, whether it was oppression, whether it was violence, who took it on the chin, who prayed for others. And that also goes for Protestant neighbours too, who were incredibly good Christians. What I came to really, really dislike, particularly in my own church, was the ineptitude of the hierarchy. And it began for me probably with I was a teenager during Vatican II, early teenager, really into the church and into going to what we call patrician meetings and debates about the church. And I have to say, my school at the time, I was at a Dominican convent girls' school, and I remember we had great debates about Humanae Vitae, and they were quite open, relatively open for the times. We're talking the 1960s, so they were relatively open. But then something seemed to clamp down on us. That great period of openness that seemed to open up all sorts of prospects, particularly on the ecumenical front, because that was where I was really always very captivated by the idea of ecumenism. I had spent a great deal of my youth in and out of Protestant churches because my friends were Protestants. When my friend Florence was married, she married a British soldier, and my sister was her bridesmaid at a time, honestly, when if you did that as a Catholic, you ran the risk of being tarred and feathered. And luckily we weren't. But at her wedding, her wonderful minister, Sidney Callahan, whom I knew very well, I was in and out of his church regularly. And Sidney remarked at the wedding that it was ironic that the one person he really knew well at that wedding was me, because he met me so often in the Shankill Road. He met me so often in and out of his church. He was a man I loved to meet because he was an arch ecumenist. There weren't many of them at the time, but he just seemed to be an inspirational character to me. And so again, I was lucky to have met and been influenced by people like him. So I was so struck with, I remember that wonderful time, you remember when Pope Paul VI gave Archbishop Michael Ramsey his episcopal ring.
Yes.
Even today, when I think of that, I just think of the waste of the time in between, because it was a wonderful moment. I remember coming across the photograph of the two of them in the Anglican Centre in Rome, which I used to frequent when I lived in Rome.
So Ramsey was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Protestant Archbishop, yeah. And it was just an amazing moment, you know. And when I went up to the top of the stairs, the first time I visited the Anglican Centre in Rome, the top of the stairs, there was just literally looking at me was the photograph of Pope Paul placing the ring on Archbishop Ramsey's finger. Now, this is like, 50 odd years later, and I just felt convulsed with tears, because what came to me was, oh dear God, we've wasted half a century here.
Yeah, it's true.
That was the high watermark.
I feel it too, so intensely, the rejection really by the hierarchy of the Vatican II impulse. But then, Mary, pedophilia, priests abusing, raping children.
Wow.
Where are we? Where I have people who say to me, even though I'm a fierce critic of the church, how can I possibly stay a Catholic? How do you answer that question?
I answer it I can only answer for myself, James. I tell you what, I'm not evangelical about the church anymore. I absolutely abhor the idea. I don't think we're ready to be evangelical. I don't think we've any right to be evangelical. I think there's so much to clear up, so much of a mess to clear up, that we'd be far better turn all our spotlights on the internal mess. If we get that right, then we can go out to the world and talk about being evangelical, but for the time being, no. So, and my children ask me that question, why do you bother? And I say, because I think when I look at what the church, and I'm talking here about the people of God, my faith in Christ, the idea of love, that idea that God somehow intervened in the world and said to us, would you stop fighting and start loving? And if you do that, you will discover that love actually works. That was what I said to my husband the day when I was elected and I went into the president's house. As we walked through the door for the very first time, through the door of what we call Aris Run, I said to Martin, well, at the end of my tenure, I said, we'll know whether this great commandment to love one another really works, because that's what we're going to do. And so I think, it's the biggest NGO in the world, James. There's actually not its equal anywhere in the world. The church across 5 continents, 200,000 schools, 1.3 billion people, such a key influencer of cultures, sometimes for the bad, a lot of time when I think of how it holds back the progress of women across cultures, holds back the culture, holds on to a culture of homophobia and misogyny, all that damage, holds on to a culture, a really weird culture around human sexuality, which is most unhealthy. All of that. But I think we are now being equipped with the tools to pull that apart, to rid ourselves of it. I think that's actually God's gift to us in this generation, that we have the education and we have the tools to now interrogate that, to probe that, to point it out, and to bring the church, hopefully, and the people of God with us into some kind of a new alignment with a loving God and a loving Christ, not with this inept curia, this utterly inept church governance, which has so little to do with Christ and everything to do with old imperial structures. I mean, we have to remind ourselves, some of us were so ignorant of our church's laws and teachings in many ways. It took me a long time to understand how this church of ours is still hugely influenced by the notion of empire. And it's not that long ago since a church which had been a temporal empire with an emperor and armies and killing people, all of that, for a millennium. It's only since 1870 that was surrendered, and not graciously either. And it's only in the early part of the 20th century that popes begin to realize they're not getting the empire back, it's not coming back. It's reduced now to that golf club size thing that we call the Vatican City State. But still they hold on to structures that became so embedded. and also over time so anti-intellectual. This is what really bothers me, James. I used to be so proud of the church's intellectual tradition, not proud of it anymore,
Yes.
particularly when I look at the hierarchy. But what I am proud of is the burgeoning grassroots intellectual tradition, fueled now by massified second and third level education, particularly in the Western world.
Yeah.
It's a great gift.
Mary, one of
That's
the
why I
things that,
stay. I live in hope, you know.
well, you live in hope, but you do more. You actually are embracing in powerful ways the very levers needed to carry forward with reform. It's an astonishment that you left office as president and immediately, as you put it in your book, donned the backpack and tennis
Hoodie,
shoes
flat
and the
shoes.
hoodie and became a student. And you
Yes.
got a doctorate in canon law, of all things, at the Vatican. Mary, what were you thinking?
What was
But-
I thinking? I ask myself that every
Yes.
day.
But also, didn't it prepare you to wage this campaign for reform?
That's
Didn't
why
it?
I did it, James. Look,
Yes.
you and I both know that in the church, particularly if one's dealing with doctrine, particularly if one's dealing with church law, it's so easy to be ignored if you have no credentials.
Yeah.
And in particular, to be sneered at if you have no academic credentials. Now, I'm a civil lawyer, you know, by profession, but I had always been interested in canon law. And one of the reasons I became a lawyer way back as a youngster, you know, as a teenager, was I was living in a dysfunctional country where people were, you know, people that I belonged to were routinely kept out of government, kept out of jobs, kept out of housing, and had very little access to a system that they could, a governmental and legal system they could believe in. So that's why I became a lawyer. I thought, well, maybe the law can help straighten this out. And honestly, I think the law has made a huge contribution to peace in Northern Ireland, and in particular to growing an underpinning, an infrastructure of rights that allow us to believe that for the future, there will be parity of esteem, there'll be justice, there'll be equality. So as I was analysing what was going on in the Catholic Church and seeing the role played by canon law, I thought, well, there's something badly wrong with the legal system here. It has its big universal legal system, but I need to know it. So I started to study canon law before I left office. I did a master's degree in canon law while I was still president. And so that was to prepare me for the day when I would leave office. And then my plan was to go to Rome. And because I couldn't do it, there's no place in Ireland where I could study to become a canon lawyer, believe it or not. And there was no place in England where I could study to become a canon lawyer. And to do it in English, I'd have to go to Washington or to Canada, to St. Paul's in Canada. And I didn't want to leave my family that far behind. So I headed to Rome to do it through Italian, God help me, in the Pontifical Gregorian University. Never have regretted a day of that. I qualified as a canon lawyer, did my licentiate, and then decided to stay on and do a doctorate in children's rights and canon law, because this is the most overlooked area. The most overlooked area is the role of baptism in your life and mine. Being baptized into the Catholic Church completely changed the trajectory of my life. I was a week old. I don't know what age you were, but I was a week old. 84% of us are babies when we are baptized. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think infant baptism, the theology of it is beautiful. You know, if you believe in original sin, which frankly I have doubts about, but if you believe in original sin, that's how you get rid of it and you open the door to salvation. You're embraced into the body of Christ. You have Christ's grace or God's grace with you, if you want it, as a resource, an invitation, not an obligation, an invitation. And I like all that. What I don't like is the canon law part that says you're 2 weeks old now, or you're 2 days old, or you're a month old, and you've just become for life a member of the Catholic Church by virtue of that baptismal ceremony. And by virtue of promises that you never made, because who made promises at 2 weeks old? And now you're a member and you have this much rights and you have this much obligations, and they're going to follow you for life. And what do those obligations do? They tell you that all those wonderful human rights that are God-given, your right to intellectual freedom, to your own conscience, to your own thought, to your own opinion, to your freedom of expression that are all set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the church constantly lauds as a document, but never, ever says has an impact on church members. Never. And so I look at canon law, and all those beautiful rights are suddenly we're told, well, actually, see your freedom of expression. No, that's clipped by virtue of the obligation to take on a baptism. Your freedom of conscience, your freedom of thought, your freedom of opinion, you have to follow the magisterium. You have to be obedient to the teaching of the bishops. Now, those bishops are the same people, many of them, who have been responsible for the unqualified chaos of the child clerical sex abuse scandals and the way in which they handled it, not in the interest of victims, not out of empathy or desire to help these poor, unfortunate children who grew to dysfunctional adulthood, so many of them, but rather to protect a blessed man-made institution and to protect the reputations of priests. So I don't have any respect for them. And so I say when there are aspects of church teaching that I absolutely categorically think are wrong, like Humanae Vitae, teaching on women, teaching on human sexuality, teaching on LGBTI, all of that, when I look at that, I say, I don't have to believe that. I don't have to believe it. I have a God-given right to form my own conscience, to express my own opinion, to have my own thoughts. And this was given to me as the most fundamental gift that God gives to all of us, every human being, by virtue of their human dignity. There are governments that try to take it away, of course they do. There are authoritarian dictators who try to take it away. And our church has been an authoritarian dictator in that regard for generations. And it never, ever turns the spotlight internally and says, hang on a minute, you see those human rights that are God-given? How should they impact members of the church? Is it right that you and I, as babies, are enrolled for life? And that if we dare to try to leave, we are regarded as what? We're regarded as schismatics, or we're regarded as apostates, we're regarded as heretics. These things are regarded as crimes. So this is right up my street. I love all this stuff, you see.
Mary,
And I won't let them away with it.
You have earned the power of your voice with your life, your commitments, and now your renewed education. And it's just so powerful to listen to you. I'm going to turn to our other listeners, the other people who are part of our gathering today, and invite them in. I have a question and answer button that I'm about to press. Let me read one of the questions to you, Mary, for your comment. This is from Fergal McCarthy. Please ask President McAleese about her views on the use of official state apologies within international relations and the British-Irish context in an effort to aid community healing and cross-community relations. For example, Blair's apology for the famine, Cameroon's apology for the events of Bloody Sunday, President Higgins' pause at the memorial of Lord Mountbatten. Your comment, Mary?
I think these things are incredibly important because for many people who have been the victims of oppression, who have been the victims, for example, of state violence, their experience has been not only the experience of the violence itself, but the denial of official responsibility and the characterization of those who complain about the lack of apology as being in some way subversive, as whingers, as people of little value. And I've lived within that thinking, of feeling that you're up against a monumental machine that is so unresponsive to human hurt and human suffering, that when something breaks through that machine, when something breaks through that apparent wall of official indifference, and you hear the voice of an apology, you begin to realize that you're winning and that there is real hope, and that the hope comes from never giving up. There are people who've fought battles here for 40 years, for hundreds of years, to try and handed on batons to try and get those apologies, who never gave up, where others said, what's the point? And I think to keep going, to keep battering away and keep insisting on truth, to keep insisting that somebody expresses sorrow. I think that particularly at the level of government, I think that's desperately important. I mean, I was very much involved in the Guildford 4 Maguire family, particularly the Maguire family affair way back whenever the Maguire family went to prison for nothing, spent years in prison as so-called bombers, which they weren't. I mean, all those, Birmingham 6, Guildford 4, the Maguire family, they all completely compromised the British political system, its judicial system, its policing system. And so, like Bloody Sunday, there were cover-ups all over the place. But somehow, truth found a wee space. And for years and years and years and decades, people kept agitating to get the truth out. And eventually it happened. They were released from prison, not before some died in prison or some lives were ruined by imprisonment, wasted through imprisonment. But there were always those who believed that truth eventually would out. I'm not saying that the truth and that the apologies will heal everybody, because they won't. Sometimes there are things you cannot heal. Sometimes they're beyond, we're so far beyond healing. But what they can offer is hope to the people who today are still confronted with official indifference over whatever it is that the officialdom is responsible for, that they can keep on pushing to show up the compromisability, the corruptibility of officialdom. And then in the hope that that comes an opportunity for learning a lesson. And that from that lesson, that indifference and that cold indifference doesn't continue for another generation.
Mary, here's a very concrete instance of that very train of thought. A question offered by Thomas Carty. What is your perspective on the mother and baby home scandal, and particularly the government's response to it and the church's involvement? And what has been your and Martin's engagement with it?
Yeah, the mother and baby home scandal is one of those, it's one of those stories, isn't it, that really highlights the point that I was making earlier in relation to the church about how today, with the massification of free second level education, the massification of third level education, stories, secrets, and lies and forms of oppression that lay dormant and where there was phenomenal suffering endured by people because they had no one to protect them, no voice to speak for them. They had no status, they had no standing. And all those who had status and standing had a vested interest in collaborating to create this bunker of silence. That's now, those bunkers of silence are going. Government has offered an apology for the mother and baby homes. The church has been implicated because, of course, many of these mother and baby homes, not all, but well, actually, many of them were run by faith-based institutions, a majority of them Catholic, some of them not, some of them other denominations, and they have all been implicated. These were Christians doing this, you know. These were Christians doing this. And of course, the mother and baby homes report, the report done by 3 eminent academics and experts in the field, points the finger to at society, which was also complicit, at families, which went along with the way in which women who got pregnant, whether it was outside of marriage, as in most of these cases was the case, how they were treated like complete social pariahs. And the poor wee children then, you know, surrendered to futures so uncertain. And as soon as the adoption papers signed, no one really cared about them anymore, except these poor women who were left to carry the absence of their children in their hearts over generations. So I think it's been the biggest learning curve for us, one of the biggest learning curves. That also, of course, in the Magdalene Laundry story, which my husband was involved in because he chaired the committee that was set up by government to look at government's involvement in the Magdalene laundries, having gone several times to particularly to the European Union, to a number of committees that look at human rights issues. And our government said it had no responsibility for these Magdalene laundries. In fact, that particular report showed that it did have responsibility, and it apologized and it set up a scheme for recompense, as indeed has also been set up for the mother and babies home. So I think this is all part of the excitement of living in these times, that the days of secrets and lies and protected zones that protected people like the church, particularly church hierarchies, church structures, that we now can penetrate those with scholarship, you know, with advocacy, with groups that get together and forge alliances to ensure that the stories of these silenced people get told and get elevated above those who would have silenced them. So I think there's great prospects for the future.
Mary, you refer to the learning curve of people of our generation are having to reckon with these scandals, the revelations, the failures of institutions. What do you find among the young people you're privileged to work with at Trinity College now? The great, bright, hopeful young men and women who are in your charge. What do they make of these stories? What do they make of these revelations?
Well, they're horrified by them. They're horrified by them, and they are educated by them. And they are made skeptical by them, which I think is great, to grow up with a kind of a scholarly skepticism. When I was growing up, everything that was given to us and told to us, you know, that we weren't taught to be critical. We weren't taught to exercise critical thinking, particularly in relation to the church and its teaching. Quite the opposite. We were told to be obedient, silent, passive. These young people have grown up in a different element, in a different place, because they've grown up with human rights. They've grown up with issues to do with the advancement of women. They've grown up to do with issues to do with the advancement of LGBTIQ people in our community. We've just gone through 2 referenda, one in 2015, as you know, one in 2018, one on same-sex marriage, one on abortion, both overwhelming, like 66% of the population supporting same-sex marriage, supporting broader abortion laws. And this is in Ireland. You know, this is in the new Ireland of educated and scholarly skepticism, where people don't just, in the past, when issues like this were raised, and, you know, I can say I was as much both a victim of it as anybody else, you know, who, you know, you believed what you were taught because you were brought up to be passive about so many things. In the past, when these issues were raised, you know, a bishop would speak up and say, actually, here's the answer to that. And that was supposed to silence all opposition because they had all the answers and we were not entitled to ask the questions. Today, we have phenomenal intergenerational debates. Today, you meant, Miriam mentioned earlier, I think, or Marion mentioned that one of the first lecture in this series was given by Archbishop Dermot Martin, who was our Archbishop in Dublin during both those referenda. And, you know, he was just excellent, really excellent. He obviously took the church's side, but the one thing he didn't ever do was to say, here's how you must vote. Or here's how, if you're a Catholic, you must vote. He never did that. In fact, he said the opposite. He said, the time is long gone when the bishops tell anybody how to vote. So there was a massive, obvious sea change. Now, not every bishop would necessarily have agreed with him, but he gave really extraordinary leadership. And our young people today have grown up with that kind of leadership. They've grown up with open questions, open debate, and the freedom to think for themselves. In a church that is now so, particularly a hierarchy that is so battered by its own ineptitude. At one level it's ineptitude, and at the other level it's corruption. Yeah. That trust is gone. So people are entitled to say to them now when they speak, you know, when they speak, our young people are entitled to say, yeah, I hear what you say, but you know what, I actually don't agree with it, and I don't have to agree with it. And yes. They don't, and they know they don't. They know they don't, which is great, because yes. Many of us grew up not knowing that.
That's true. Mary, another question, Mary. Catherine Shannon offers this one. By the way,
hi, Catherine.
I know perhaps you do too. I know Catherine from the old days, also a key Boston-based supporter of the peace process. Catherine says, Mary, what is your view of the impact that civil society and especially women, had on moving the peace process forward in the mid-90s? And do you see women as equally important at grassroots level in bringing the church back to its essential inclusiveness from the time of Christ?
A big yes to that second part of that question. Just if I could take the second part of that, Catherine, because at the moment, as you know, there is this this movement on the church. Pope Francis has initiated what he's calling the Synod on Synodality, and right across the church, the Universal Church, there is a debate on synods and synodality. One of the best actually was one that was not initiated by bishops at all, or episcopacy at all, but the Root and Branch synod in Bristol, which really had a universal jurisdiction. It was largely virtual and organized by lay people, but really started about, as women discussed among Catholic women, discussed the very question you raised, James, with me. What are we still doing in this church that, that has so many problems and is so highly problematic, particularly around issues to do with women? Why are we bothered? And we're bothered because we still believe in the Christian vision, and because we believe the church has something to offer, and because we believe that the people who have embedded dysfunction in it need to be educated about their role in that dysfunction, and really honestly that their role needs to be changed. So we have a cause, and our cause is really making the church a place of true loving embrace for everybody. And I think mothers of children, mothers of gay children, mothers of young women whom they really want to see do well in the world, we that power behind us, we that momentum behind us. We have our kids' backs, and we don't want the church to exclude them. We don't want it to hurt them or hold them back, not just in our jurisdiction, but all over the world, where that embedded misogyny, that embedded homophobia, because the church is present on 5 continents and hugely influential, we want that changed. We want the church to be what we think Christ wanted it to be, a place that embraced, that loved, and didn't hit them over the head with books of canon law, at every hand's turn. So that's why I think, yes, women are so important at grassroots level in bringing the church back. And if the church loses the women, the church has lost. It's just as simple as that. And in the same way, Catherine would know this well, that many of the organizations in Northern Ireland that conduce to building bridges when they were very hard to build cross communities, very often it was women's groups that were doing that. Little groups at community level, woman to woman, family to family, trying to build just simply friendships with one another, because it's very difficult in a community where 93% of people live in areas that are actually, designated Catholic or Protestant. There weren't natural, spontaneous, organic ways of meeting. They had to go to a lot of bother to meet each other, to engage with each other, to build little projects, to grow in trust, to get to know, and to be open enough to listen to each other's stories, stand in each other's shoes. And honestly, I could say, I think without fear of contradiction, Catherine, that it was women who first showed the willingness to stand in each other's shoes and led the way.
And your voice is so important for many reasons, but most importantly, because you are a woman who is refusing the invitation to accept a second-class status in this church. In your book, you referred to the empire of misogyny.
That's right.
There's another question here that reminds us that we in the United States now, for only the second time, have a Catholic president, an Irish Catholic at that.
Yeah, and look how the bishops are treating him.
And that's exactly to the point of Ted Smith's question to you. Before I read what Ted says, I want to remind people, if they don't know it, that you were also a president who got in trouble over the question of communion. Shortly after you were inaugurated, you attended services at Christ Church Cathedral.
Christ Church, Protestant Cathedral, of which I am a canon.
And you received communion quite notoriously.
Imagine, and our Archbishop, our Catholic Archbishop, described that as a sham. He described the Protestant Eucharist as a sham.
Yeah.
I mean, caused a ridiculous row in a community where we should be building ecumenical relations where we should be embracing one another. It caused a huge row, but of course, the good news is the vast majority of people, Catholic and Protestant, thought it was the right thing to do.
Of course.
Which tells me that so often it is the people from their lived everyday experience who should be allowed to lead the churches because
Indeed.
they know where they want to go. But unfortunately, the people who get to the top very often can be the people who want to hold us back. That is very true in the case of the Catholic Church, as it happens in the case of the Protestant Church. I mean, I look at people like Archbishop Walton, MP, fabulous man, absolutely wonderful. I look at the relationship between Archbishop Jackson, the Protestant Archbishop, and our Catholic Archbishop Diarmuid Martin, just quietly showing in every way possible that they get on with one another and they respect each other and doing the right thing. And so for me, I think if we had been allowed to have intercommunion 50 years ago, we would be a very different, Northern Ireland would be a very different place.
Well, that reminds me of Hans Kung's great mantra, no peace among peoples or nations without peace among religions.
Correct.
No peace among religions without dialogue between religions. No dialogue between religions without change within each religion.
Correct.
So that 3 steps.
Wasn't he wonderful? So
Hans Kung was a great hero of the Catholic Church of our lifetime, very much so. Let me go back to Mr. Smith's question, though. As a reformist Catholic, what would be your advice to Catholic Americans like President Biden and Senator Casey, who are often denied communion because they support the legal right of abortion? Any word of advice to President Biden?
Well, President Biden needs no advice from me. I think he is by far, he's an outstandingly pastoral man as a president. I love the pastoral side of this man who has suffered so grievously and yet is such a gracious human being. I absolutely admire and respect the bones of the man. I'm so glad he is the president of the United States. So relieved, so reassured, and such a decent man. And I'm so hurt by how he's treated by the American bishops, this great man. And I would say to him what I say to myself every day: read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have freedom of speech, you have freedom of expression, you have freedom to inform your own conscience, freedom of opinion, freedom of belief, freedom of your own religion, freedom to change religion. And look at what the Catholic Church's teaching is about all those things. It denies you every single one of them if you are a member of the Catholic Church. If you are a member of the Catholic Church, Catholic canon law dares to say that these things that were given to you by God for God's edification and for your own edification, it dares to say, actually, we, the clergy, the magisterium, we reserve the right to curb every single one of those rights, every single one of them. So I say to him, keep on doing what you're doing. Show your deep love and affection for church. Show your particular wonderful affection for the Eucharist, which I share with him. Your wonderful affection for God's grace and humble acceptance of the need for God's grace in the Eucharist. Keep doing it, and then keep using the gifts of intellectual freedom that God gave you. Because honestly, the bishops, as a general rule in the United, with very few exceptions, there are a few exceptions, I just find them an embarrassment, as I find many senior churchmen today an embarrassment to the Christian gospel.
And Mary, we only have a minute or 2 left, but I'd like to ask you to cast your eye forward as far distant into the future as you care. 100 years, say. What will the state of the Catholic Church be then? How do you imagine it?
That I'm not so sure of, because earlier we talked about its role as an empire, and I look at where all the empires that it was part of have gone to. Back in 1870, when the Papal States were lost, and the Pope became, for the first time in a millennium, not an emperor. Many of the great empires, including the British Empire, you had the German Empire, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had the Belgian Empire, you had Spanish, the Portuguese. Where are they now? All of them. They're all gone. They're pretty much gone. Because imperialism was never a humanly decent or good preoccupation. It was selfish, it was greedy, it was grasping. It imposed itself on cultures. It skewed those cultures. It rendered whole peoples irrelevant, made them feel small, made them feel like nothing. So many of them are gone now. And I think for the future, the Catholic Church faces a big crisis of trying to move out of the remnants of its imperial structure, which are still evident in its governance structure, completely evident in its governance structure. And it needs to move out from that. It needs to look, if it doesn't move out from under that, if it does not embrace a whole new mode of governance that involves the people of God right across the board, if it doesn't declericalize, if it doesn't end misogyny, if it doesn't end homophobia, it will simply end because it will become irrelevant. Or as Hans Kuhn said, it will become a largely irrelevant large cult. That's the future that is being conducted for us at the moment by an inept governance structure. And I include everybody today who's involved in that governance structure, regrettably, also including Pope Francis himself at the moment. I just regard him as I think he's, whatever reforming urges or aspects there have been to his work internally, he has not been able to effect the kind of reforms or the pace of reform that would guarantee the church of the future a kind of a healthy future. He just hasn't been able to do that for whatever reason. And there's no sign on it at the moment that is going to happen, but there are good signs. I look at the German church, phenomenal leadership from the German church. And by that, I mean both the governance of it, the bishops and the laity working together. Be very interested to see what comes out of their synod. I look at the synod on the laity that is now being replicated around the world, the synod, I beg your pardon, of and by the laity, the root and branch, which is now taking off like the genie out of the bottle around the world. And this is lay people and clerics working together for a different kind of church, root and branch. So I'm hopeful that it might survive. Honestly, if it doesn't, it won't kill me if it doesn't. But I'd hate to think of all the people right around the world who rely on those structures, those schools, those hospitals, those clinics that are conducted by the people of God in their hands. I would hate that to fall away because it is capable of doing really great good in the world. And in order to do the fullest good, we need to get rid of the dark stuff that it brings with it.
Well, that glimpse into the future of the church brings us close to the end of our time, Mary. I want to end, though, by saying the future of Ireland is brighter than it ever might have been imagined to be because of you. The bridges you built between Protestants and Catholics, between North and South, between England and the home island, have given the Irish people a new future, which is why all of us who love Ireland, President McAleese, love you.
Oh, thank you, James. I
Thank
find that a very
thank
moving
you. Thank
thing to
you.
hear.
And
Thank
I'll turn it back over to Miriam now.
Thank you so much.
What a
God bless you and all you're doing.
Oh, thank you both so much. That was just wonderful, and such important topics and such sensitivity and intellectual rigor, and just an absolute pleasure. Jim, thank you for moderating it so well, and President McAleese, Mary, thank you. I mean, this is just such an important resource, and we're so honoured that through Luxman Ireland House and through the generosity of both of you today and the Irish Institute that we could facilitate this very uplifting conversation despite some of the darkness involved in some of the topics. Thank you both for the ambassadorial roles that you both perform on your stages and different ways, and what a beautiful complementarity in terms of you coming together today.
Don't forget, can I thank the Glucksman Institute, because wherever the word Glucksman is, wherever the name Glucksman is used, it's about letting in light, always about letting in light and warmth. And it's just so wonderful to be part of this. And of course, the same with the Institute. Can I thank you for all the work that you do to let in the light?
Thank you.
That's
very, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. We will, with your blessing, Jim and Mary, I'm using that pun intentionally, publish this interview on
by all means
later. I'll encourage we've a lovely lineup of our community here. I just want to acknowledge we've a number of members of the board of Glucksman Ireland House, including our president, Ted Smith, who answered a great question, and the president of the Irish Institute, Eileen Flannelly-Mackle, is on the line there as well. So thank you everyone in our community who's here live with us for bearing witness to this very important conversation. And I encourage you to go back and look at it later and to share it with your friends and your students and your colleagues and everyone, because it really is wonderful. For the season that's in May, we wish you both a happy Christmas, and we hope that before long, both yourself, President McAleese, and James, will be hosting you here in Glucksman Ireland House, that it won't look so quiet and lonely with me here. And thank you once again for a really, really beautiful intervention to send us off over the weekend. Thank you to you both.
Happy Christmas to everybody. Have a good one.
God bless.
Thank you so much. God bless. And thank you to James for that lovely
Goodbye,
session.
Mary.
Thank you.
Be well,
Lovely
Mary.
to see you again, James. God bless and all you do. You keep
Thank
us
you,
going.
Mary. Keep
Give
it
us
going.
heart.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Mary. All the best.
God bless.
Bye,
Bye-bye,
Mary.
everyone.
Bye, Jim. Thanks a
Bye,
lot.
Miriam. To be well.
You too.